The story unfolds with a dramatic twist right from the beginning. Poirot was strapping up his small valise, a look of concentration on his face. Hastings, entering the room, could not help but ask, "Poirot, are you called away on a case?" "Indeed, mon ami," Poirot replied with a small but enigmatic smile. "Though I must admit, the affair, at first glance, does not seem promising. It's a curious matter brought to me by the Northern Union Insurance Company. A man named Mr. Maltravers insured his life for £50,000 only weeks ago, and now he is dead." "Dead?" Hastings leaned forward, intrigued. "How did he die?" "An internal hemorrhage," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing. "Nothing remarkable on the surface, but there are whispers, Hastings, whispers of financial ruin. They say Mr. Maltravers was on the verge of bankruptcy. Such rumors change everything, do they not?" Hastings' eyes widened. "You mean to say, we, Hastings," Poirot interrupted. "It is suspected that he insured his life for his young wife's benefit, and then committed suicide to save her from destitution. Such schemes are not unheard of. The insurance company wants me to investigate." Poirot's tone turned sharp as he grabbed his hat. "5 minutes to pack your bag, mon ami. We leave for Essex immediately." An hour later, they alighted at a quiet little station and began their walk to Marsdon Manor. Hastings, ever curious, asked, "What's the plan, Poirot?" "We shall begin with the doctor," Poirot replied. "There is only one in this village, Dr. Bernard. He will provide the initial answers." Arriving at a quaint cottage with a brass nameplate, Poirot rang the bell. Dr. Bernard, a stooped but amiable man, welcomed them into his consulting room. Poirot wasted no time. "Doctor, I'm investigating Mr. Maltravers' death on behalf of the Northern Union Insurance Company. Can you provide me with the details of his demise?" The doctor sighed, his gaze distant. "A tragic case. A hemorrhage, quite sudden. There was blood on his lips, though most of the bleeding was internal. He was found lying at the edge of a small plantation, his rook rifle beside him." "Was he still alive when you arrived?" Poirot asked sharply. "No, he had passed by the time I was called," Dr. Bernard replied. "It's clear to me. A gastric ulcer caused the hemorrhage." "And yet," Poirot's voice took on a razor-sharp edge, "there are rumors of Mr. Maltravers' financial troubles. Do you think it's possible that he engineered his own death?" The doctor looked startled. I wouldn't know about that. But his wife, poor young creature, is devastated. She's in no state to discuss such matters." Poirot's little gray cells were already hard at work. "Merci, doctor. One last question. Did you ever treat Mr. Maltravers before his death?" "No," Dr. Bernard said firmly. "He was a follower of Christian Science and avoided medical advice." As they left the doctor's cottage, Hastings couldn't help but voice his thoughts. "Poirot, do you think this is a simple case of natural death?" Poirot's eyes glinted with determination. "Non, mon ami. The more simple a case appears, the more complex it often is. We must tread carefully. Marsdon Manor holds secrets yet to be uncovered." The scene was set, the mystery deepened, and Poirot was ready to untangle the threads of deception with his unparalleled intellect. Poirot's keen eyes never missed a detail, and as he stood before Dr. Bernard, he spoke humbly yet pointedly. "Pardon, doctor, but if my memory serves me, wasn't there a recent case of murder where a verdict of heart failure was later amended when a bullet wound was discovered?" The doctor's face reddened, his tone dry and defensive. "You will find no such bullet wounds on Mr. Maltravers, I assure you. Now, gentlemen, if there is nothing further—" The sharpness in his voice was unmistakable, and it was clear they had overstayed their welcome. Poirot, ever polite, rose and tipped his hat, saying, "Thank you, Doctor, for your assistance. By the way, was there no need for an autopsy?" At this, Dr. Bernard's composure broke, his face turning apoplectic. "Absolutely not." The cause of death was perfectly clear. In my profession, we see no reason to cause undue distress to the relatives of the deceased. With a curt nod, he turned and slammed the door, leaving Poirot and Hastings standing on the porch. As they walked toward Marsdon Manor, Hastings ventured, "What do you make of Dr. Bernard, Poirot?" Without missing a beat, Poirot replied, "A rather pompous old fool, don't you think?" Hastings grinned, but was caught off guard when Poirot added with a twinkle, "Your judgment is always impeccable, my friend, except, of course, when a beautiful woman is involved." Hastings looked affronted, but Poirot's serious demeanor hinted at mischief. They soon arrived at the manor, where a middle-aged parlor-maid ushered them into a small morning room after receiving Poirot's card and a letter of introduction. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation as they waited. Finally, the door opened to reveal a slender woman in widow's weeds, her beauty marred only by the redness of her tear-filled eyes. "Monsieur Poirot," she faltered. Poirot leapt gallantly to his feet. "Madame, my sincerest apologies for troubling you during such a difficult time, but alas, duty knows no mercy." Mrs. Maltravers allowed Poirot to lead her to a chair, her delicate frame trembling. Her voice, tinged with exhaustion and sorrow, whispered, "This is about my husband's insurance, isn't it? Must I be bothered now so soon?" Poirot's tone softened as he replied, "Courage, madame, courage. Your late husband insured his life for a significant sum. In such cases, certain inquiries must be made. Rest assured, I will do everything possible to ease this burden. Could you recount briefly the events of that fateful Wednesday?" Her voice trembled as she described the moment her maid informed her that one of the gardeners had found her husband. Her words trailed off, overcome with emotion. Poirot reached out, gently pressing her hand. "I comprehend, madame. Earlier that afternoon, had you seen your husband?" She shook her head. "Not since lunch. I had walked to the village for some stamps. He was pottering around the grounds, likely shooting rooks. I heard a few shots in the distance." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "The rook rifle, where is it now?" Rising, she retrieved the weapon from the hall and handed it to Poirot. He examined it meticulously. "2 shots fired, I see. Merci, madame. And now, if I may—" His words trailed delicately as she averted her gaze, instructing the maid to lead him upstairs. Left alone with the grieving widow, Hastings struggled to navigate the delicate silence. He offered a few sympathetic reflections, to which she responded absently. Within moments, Poirot rejoined them, his manner courteous yet resolute. "Thank you for your kindness, madame. One final question, if I may. Were you aware of your husband's financial position?" She shook her head, her voice barely audible. "Nothing whatsoever. I am terribly stupid with business matters." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "So you cannot explain why he suddenly decided to insure his life for such a large sum?" Her expression grew distant. "We had been married just over a year. He was certain he would not live long. He had already suffered one hemorrhage and feared another would be fatal. I tried to dismiss these fears, but he was adamant." Her voice broke, and Poirot, ever the gentleman, rose and offered a slight bow. "Merci, madame. You have been most helpful. Please, rest assured, I will do all in my power to bring clarity to this matter." With that, the investigation's web grew tighter, the threads of suspicion weaving a tale far more complex than it first appeared. As we departed the house, her final words lingered in the air, her voice heavy with sorrow. "He was only too right," she murmured, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Poirot, ever the master of deduction, gestured animatedly as we strolled down the drive. "Well, Hastings, that's that," he said briskly. "Back to London, my friend, no mouse in this mousehole." He paused dramatically, then added, "And yet, what a slight discrepancy." I shot him a puzzled glance. "Discrepancy? What discrepancy?" I asked, intrigued. He shrugged theatrically. "Life is full of discrepancies, mon ami, but assuredly the man could not have taken his own life. There is no poison that would fill his mouth with blood. No, this is all quite above board, or so it seems." His voice trailed off as his sharp eyes suddenly fixed on a figure striding up the drive. The man was tall, his bronzed face speaking of distant tropic lands, and there was an intensity in his step. He passed us without so much as a nod, his presence commanding attention. Poirot, never one to miss a clue, darted to a nearby gardener who was sweeping leaves. "Tell me, I pray you, who is that gentleman?" he asked with urgency. The gardener scratched his head thoughtfully. "Can't say I remember his name, sir," he admitted, "but he stayed here last week. Tuesday, it was." Poirot's eyes lit up like a hunter spotting his prey. "Quick, Hastings, let's follow him." We hurried after the man, catching sight of him just as he reached the terrace where Mrs. Maltravers stood like a ghost, her face turning ashen. "You?" she gasped, visibly shaken. "I thought you were on the sea, on your way to East Africa." The man hesitated, then replied calmly, "I got some news from my lawyers that delayed me. My uncle in Scotland died unexpectedly and left me some money. Given the circumstances, I canceled my passage. Then I saw the dreadful news about Mr. Maltravers in the papers and came to see if there was anything I could do to help." His tone softened. "You might need someone to look after things for you now, perhaps." At that moment, they became aware of us standing nearby. Poirot stepped forward with his trademark blend of charm and excuses. "My sincerest apologies," he said, bowing slightly. "I seem to have left my stick in the hall." Mrs. Maltravers, her composure only partially restored, made the introductions reluctantly. "Miss Poirot, this is Captain Black." The captain acknowledged us politely, but I couldn't help but notice the tension that lingered in the air. As soon as we left, Poirot grabbed my arm, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "You noticed, Hastings, how she paled at the sight of him? And how devoted he seemed? Most interesting, don't you think?" His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "And he was here on Tuesday night, the day before Mr. Maltravers died. Oh yes, Hastings, we must investigate Captain Black further. There's more to this story than meets the eye." Back in the village, Poirot wasted no time. "To the Anchor Inn," he declared, leading the way. There, we set up camp in a corner room, waiting for our new friend to return. Poirot's confidence was unshakable. "I told them we were taking the first train to London," he explained, smirking. "Possibly you thought I meant it, but no, mon ami, I merely set the stage." When Captain Black finally appeared, Poirot intercepted him with ease, drawing him into our room under the pretext of discussing the late Mr. Maltravers. "Captain Black, I understand you were an old family friend." Poirot began with practiced sincerity. "I'm hoping you might shed some light on Mr. Maltravers' state of mind before his unfortunate passing. It's a delicate matter, and I'd rather not distress Mrs. Maltravers with too many painful questions." The young soldier nodded earnestly, his tone measured. "I'll help however I can, of course," he said, "but I didn't notice anything unusual. To be honest, although my family knew Maltravers well, I didn't know him personally all that much. I was only visiting briefly." His words hung in the air, and Poirot's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, a spark of intrigue igniting as the web of mystery deepened. Captain Black leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing slightly as he considered Poirot's next question. "You came down when?" Poirot asked casually, though his sharp gaze missed nothing. "Tuesday afternoon," Black replied. "I left early Wednesday morning for London. My boat was sailing from Tilbury around midday, but, well, plans changed." "Ah, yes," Poirot nodded, leaning forward slightly. "You did mention something about unexpected news, I believe." Black gave a short, almost reluctant nod. "Yes. As I explained to Mrs. Maltravers, I received some news from my lawyers about an inheritance. My uncle in Scotland passed away, quite unexpectedly. It meant canceling my passage to East Africa." "East Africa?" Poirot prompted with feigned curiosity, as though he didn't already know. Black's expression softened, his voice warming. "Yes, I've been working there ever since the war. A remarkable country, really. Untamed, beautiful, full of opportunity." "Fascinating," Poirot said, tilting his head thoughtfully. "Now, if you recall, what was the talk about at dinner on Tuesday night? Anything particular stand out?" Black rubbed his chin, the lines on his face deepening as he thought. "Oh, the usual odds and ends, really. Maltravers asked about my family. Then there was a bit of chatter about German reparations. Mrs. Maltravers was quite curious about East Africa, so I ended up sharing a few stories, yarns about lions and safaris and the like. Nothing out of the ordinary." Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. "Merci, Captain. Now, with your permission, I'd like to try a little experiment, purely psychological." Black blinked, his guard visibly going up. "Psychological? What sort of experiment?" Poirot's tone turned soothing, almost disarming. "Ah, nothing to worry about. Not psychoanalysis, if that's what you fear. Simply a word association game. I say a word. You respond with the very first word that comes to mind. Simple, no?" Black hesitated, his unease showing, but he finally nodded. "All right, if you think it'll help." Poirot beamed and turned to me. "Hastings, note down the words, if you please." Then, pulling his oversized pocket watch from his coat, he placed it deliberately on the table. "Let us begin." He started slowly, his voice calm, yet deliberate. "Day." Black paused only briefly before replying. "Night." Poirot nodded approvingly. "Name." "Place." "Bernard." A flicker of confusion crossed Black's face. "No, nothing. Tuesday. Dinner. Journey. Ship. Country. Uganda. Story. Lions. Rook. Rifle. Farm. Shot. Suicide." Black visibly stiffened at the last word, but answered quickly, "Elephant." Poirot didn't flinch, his voice smooth as silk as he continued, "Tusks. Money. Lawyers." "Merci beaucoup," Poirot said at last, leaning back in his chair and clasping his hands together. "That will suffice. If you could spare me another moment in half an hour, I would be most grateful." Black nodded, though his forehead glistened with sweat. "Of course," he said, rising to his feet and wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "Anything to help." As the door clicked shut behind him, Poirot turned to me, his eyes dancing with triumph. "Well, Hastings, you see it now, don't you?" No," I admitted, feeling rather dense. "I haven't the faintest idea what you're on about." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "Ah, mon ami, always the skeptic. The list, Hastings. It tells us everything. Look here," Black answered without hesitation. "That tells us he has no guilty knowledge to hide, no hesitation, no time for his mind to fabricate or falter. his subconscious speaks freely. I frowned, glancing at the list again. It's just words. What am I missing? Observe. Poirot's finger tapped the paper with purpose. Day to night, name to place, all normal associations. But Bernard? Nothing. Clearly, he has not met the doctor. And yet, dinner to Tuesday, journey to ship, country to Uganda, they all point to his journey abroad being significant. And here, suicide. What follows? Elephant, I said, shrugging. Non, Hastings. Think. An elephant is shot for its tusks, yes. And what is money, if not the reason? Lawyers, then, to tidy up the consequences. Do you see now, Hastings? The subconscious reveals far more than the conscious ever will. Black knows more than he's letting on. And now? Poirot's grin widened, his eyes alight with excitement. Now we must see what Captain Black will reveal when he believes we know it all. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze fixed on me as he tapped the paper on the table. Hastings, the words tell us everything. Captain Black's subconscious is still caught up in the stories he shared at dinner. It's all there, lions, rifles, farms, and then, unexpectedly, the word suicide. Tell me, Hastings, what do you make of it? I frowned, scratching my head. I suppose it could mean anything. A random connection, perhaps? Poirot shook his head with a patient smile. Non, mon ami, the connection is not random. Let me guide you. Black hears rook, and his mind leaps to rifle, a natural association. But then farm. Why? And when I say shot, he answers without hesitation. Suicide. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with excitement. A man he knows committed suicide with a rook rifle on a farm. The association is too clear, Hastings. And remember, his mind is still preoccupied with the tales he told at dinner. It's all connected. You think he mentioned this particular suicide story at the dinner table? I asked, still struggling to piece it all together. Poirot nodded firmly. Exactement. And now, we shall confirm it. Captain Black was called back into the room, visibly puzzled by Poirot's request. Is there something else you need? He asked, glancing between us. Oui, Captain, Poirot said, his voice as smooth as velvet. You told some fascinating stories at dinner on Tuesday evening. Among them, I believe, was one about a man who ended his life with a rook rifle. Could you recount it for us, s'il vous plaît? Black's face changed instantly. Yes, now that you mention it, I did tell that story, he admitted, his voice hesitant. It was about a chap on a farm in East Africa. Shot himself with a rook rifle, through the roof of the mouth. The bullet lodged in his brain, and the doctors were baffled. There wasn't much blood, just a little on the lips. It was all rather odd, but what has this got to do with Mr. Maltravers? Poirot's voice was gentle, but his words struck like a thunderbolt. Captain, you did not know, but Mr. Maltravers was found with a rook rifle by his side. Your story may have given him the idea. Black's eyes widened in horror. You mean, my story suggested it to him? Mon Dieu, that's awful. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly shaken. Do not distress yourself, Captain, Poirot said reassuringly. If not your story, it would have been another thought, another way. The tragedy, alas, was inevitable. Poirot excused himself shortly after, and spent the afternoon on the telephone. When he returned, he was unusually subdued. Hastings, it is time. I must speak with Mrs. Maltravers. The thought of breaking such news to the poor woman weighed heavily on both of us. As we approached her, I couldn't help but feel a deep sympathy for the young widow. To be left not only penniless but with the knowledge that her husband had taken his own life for her sake. It was a burden no one should bear. And yet I couldn't help but notice the way Captain Black admired her. Perhaps, when her grief subsided, he might offer her some solace. The interview was as painful as I feared. Mrs. Maltravers refused to believe Poirot at first, her face pale and strained as she clung to her disbelief. But Poirot's gentle yet relentless logic left no room for doubt. At last, the truth broke over her, and she crumbled, sobbing bitterly. Poirot's voice was soft, almost tender, as he addressed her. "Madam, I am truly sorry for your loss, but you, of all people, must understand, there are no dead." She lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes wide with confusion. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Poirot leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Have you never taken part in a spiritualistic séance? You are mediumistic, are you not?" I've been told so," she stammered, her voice trembling. "But I don't believe in such things." "Perhaps you should," Poirot said cryptically. "You must know what they say in the village, madam, that this house is haunted." Her eyes widened further, and before she could respond, the parlor-maid appeared in the doorway. "Dinner is ready, madam," she announced, her voice low and subdued. Mrs. Maltravers, clearly needing a distraction, invited us to stay. "Won't you join me for dinner? I would appreciate the company." We agreed, and for a while, the somber atmosphere lightened. We had just finished our soup when a scream pierced the air. The sound of breaking crockery followed, and we sprang to our feet. The parlor-maid burst into the room, clutching her chest and trembling violently. "There was a man," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper, "standing in the passage, watching me." Poirot was on his feet in an instant, rushing into the hallway. I followed close behind, but the passage was empty. "There's no one here," Poirot declared, his voice firm. The parlor-maid clutched the doorframe for support, her face ashen. "I swear, sir," she said weakly, "he was there. Oh, it gave me such a fright." "But why, my dear girl?" Poirot asked gently. Her voice dropped to a whisper, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Because, sir, it was Mr. Maltravers." The parlor-maid's voice trembled as she stammered, I thought it was the master. It looked like him." Her face was as pale as the linen napkin she clutched in her shaking hands. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Mrs. Maltravers, seated beside me, gave a sharp, terrified start. Her lips quivered, and I saw her hands clutch at the armrests of her chair. My mind raced back to the old superstition. Could it be true? That a suicide spirit could find no rest? Her fear seemed to spill into the room like a cold, creeping mist. "Didn't you hear it?" she cried suddenly, her voice shrill. "Those 3 taps on the window. That's how he always used to tap when he passed around the house." "Ivy," I said quickly, though my voice was far from steady. "It's just the ivy scraping against the window pane." But my reassurance fell flat. The terror in her eyes was unmistakable. She clutched Poirot's arm. "You don't understand. It was him. I know it was." The atmosphere in the room grew heavier, suffocating even. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the house groan like a living thing. Shadows danced eerily on the walls, and the occasional creak of the old floorboards made my pulse quicken. When dinner was over, Mrs. Maltravers all but begged Poirot to stay. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "don't leave me alone tonight." We moved to the small morning room. The wind continued its eerie moaning, and twice the door to the room inexplicably creaked open. Each time, Mrs. Maltravers gasped and clung to me as though the very walls were conspiring against her. Poirot, clearly irritated, marched to the door and slammed it shut. "This door, it is possessed," he exclaimed, turning the key in the lock with a decisive twist. "There, it is locked now, madam. Rest easy. But she didn't. Her face turned ashen. "Don't lock it," she cried. "If it opens now, if it opens now." Her voice trailed off, and a deep silence fell over us. And then, the impossible happened. The locked door swung open, slowly, deliberately, on its own. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared, unable to comprehend. From where I sat, I couldn't see the passage beyond, but Poirot and Mrs. Maltravers were facing it. She screamed, a piercing, soul-chilling sound. "There, in the passage," she cried, her voice raw with fear. "You saw him, my husband. He was standing there." Poirot, his face tight with concentration, shook his head. "Madame, I saw nothing." "You must have," she insisted, her eyes wild. "He was there. I know he was there." "Madame," Poirot said firmly, "you are overwrought. Your nerves are unstrung. Please, calm yourself." "I am perfectly well," she shouted. "Don't treat me like I'm mad." Her voice broke, and her hands flew to her face as she began to sob. And then, without warning, the lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. The room seemed to breathe, the silence broken only by the sound of Mrs. Maltravers' faint, terrified moaning. And then it came. 3 loud, deliberate knocks, echoing through the house like a death knell. A chill crept over my skin as I turned toward the sound. Out of the darkness, a figure began to materialize. My heart stopped. It was him, the man we had seen lying dead upstairs. He stood there, faintly luminous, his face ashen and blood trickling from his lips. His eyes burned with an unnatural light as they bore into us. One hand hung limply at his side, but the other, was outstretched, pointing directly at us. Mrs. Maltravers let out a strangled cry, clutching her chest, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The figure stepped closer, his presence chilling the very air around us. Suddenly, a brilliant light emanated from his extended hand, illuminating the room in an otherworldly glow. The light passed over Poirot and me like a searing blade, but it halted, fixed on Mrs. Maltravers. She froze, her eyes locked on the apparition, her mouth opening in a silent scream. The ghostly figure stood there, unyielding, his gaze never wavering as the blood on his lips glistened in the eerie light. Poirot leaned in, his eyes gleaming with triumph as the storm outside roared on. "Did you see it, Hastings?" he asked, his voice alive with energy. Her hand, her right hand, stained red, not with blood but with red paint. She collapsed because her guilt finally overwhelmed her. And when she screamed, "Save me from him," she wasn't crying out to escape a ghost, she was pleading to escape the truth. I stared at him, struggling to piece it all together. But Poirot, the figure, the man, he was standing there clear as day. I saw him. A knowing smile curled across Poirot's lips. "Ah, mon ami, that was not the ghost of Mr. Maltravers, but a masterstroke of theatrical brilliance. Allow me to introduce you to Mr. Everett." He gestured toward the man who now stood beside us, wiping off streaks of phosphorescent paint from his face. A fine actor and an old friend of mine. I phoned him earlier today. His makeup, paired with a little phosphorescent powder and a pocket torch, created just the right illusion. And those ghostly taps on the window? The good inspector outside, whiling away the time in the wind and rain. "You staged all of this?" I exclaimed, still reeling from the revelation. "But why?" "Why?" Poirot's expression hardened, his voice sharp. "Because, Hastings, I had to catch a murderer, and Mrs. Maltravers fell into her own trap. When the lights went out, I clasped her hand, ensuring the red paint from Mr. Everett's performance stained her fingers. It was the final push she needed to confess." "But, Poirot," I pressed, "what led you to suspect her in the first place?" "Ah, mon cher Hastings, "It was the little things," Poirot replied, his tone rich with satisfaction. "First, the discrepancy with the doctor. He believed Mr. Maltravers to be a Christian Scientist, unafraid of death. Who could have given him such an impression? None other than his wife. Yet she described him to us as a man terrified for his health. Second, her reaction to Captain Black's story, a tale of suicide with a rook rifle. It was as though the idea took root in her mind then and there. And lastly," he paused, leaning closer for emphasis, "the heavily rouged eyelids. Trope dramatique. A woman truly in mourning does not take such care with her appearance, especially mere days after her husband's death." I nodded, slowly, starting to see the picture he painted. "So, it was murder, not suicide." "Exactly," Poirot confirmed. "Imagine this, a shrewd woman, tired of her elderly husband, who she only married for his money. She knows he is financially ruined, but there is hope. A large life insurance policy. All she needs is a way to ensure his untimely demise. Then, by chance, Captain Black's story gives her the perfect idea. The next afternoon she lures her husband into the garden. She feigns innocent curiosity, mentioning the story from dinner. 'Could a man really shoot himself like that?' she asks. 'Show me, darling. I don't believe it's possible.' Poirot's voice grew lower, almost conspiratorial. 'And the poor fool!' He obliges. He places the rifle in his mouth, showing her how it could be done. She crouches beside him, laughing lightly. 'And what if I pulled the trigger?' she jokes. Then, in one swift, calculated moment, she does exactly that. Bang, the deed is done. I stared at Poirot, the enormity of it sinking in, and she thought she could get away with it. 'She nearly did,' Poirot said gravely. 'But nearly is not enough when Hercule Poirot is on the case.' We walked briskly through the rain, Poirot adjusting his hat against the wind. 'And so, Hastings,' he continued, with a touch of theatrical ingenuity, we forced her hand, quite literally. The red paint was the final act, the proof she could not deny. Now the inspector waits to take her into custody.' I couldn't help but shudder at the thought of it all. Poirot, she was so cunning, so heartless. It's terrifying to think what people are capable of." Poirot stopped abruptly, turning to me with a serious look. "Yes, Hastings, but remember this. No matter how clever the crime, the truth always reveals itself in the end. And Hercule Poirot never fails to see it." With that, he adjusted his coat, nodded toward the station, and strode on into the storm, leaving me to marvel, yet again, at the brilliance of his little gray cells.